Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Burkhalter, Senior Curator here at the Des Moines Art Center. I always thank you all for coming, but I want to give an extra special thanks today because I'm looking out and there's some of you who I saw, a lot of you I saw on Friday, and some of you I even saw on Thursday and Friday. So I joke about how I am here all the time, but there are definitely a lot of you who spent the weekend here with us. So thank you so much for your dedication to what we do here. It is extremely meaningful to us. This introduction is really special to me. It feels, I always talk about, many of you heard me talk about how long it takes exhibitions to be planned, but this introduction is many more years than that in the making. If you've talked to myself or Jill about this lecture, you might hear, many of you have seen myself and Jill at the back of this lobby for 20 years now. Jill and I began sharing an office in the summer of 1999, and we were both in this tiny little office together, so we had to get along. And one of the things that we talked about was what contemporary art we liked. And one of the first things we talked about was how much we loved Liza Lou and her work kitchen. So that's how long Jill and I have been waiting for today. Kitchen is a work that combines accessibility and beauty with thematic depth and an appreciation for labor and materials that was ahead of its time. The how and why artists choose the materials they do has long been a curatorial interest of mine. I have based several exhibitions around that concept, but Liza Lou's dedication to beads and pushing that material, expanding it from maximalism to minimalism is really one of a kind, and it continues to inspire. When I began thinking about transforming a room, I would say that Liza Lou's kitchen was sort of a fairy godmother of my idea for the exhibition. And as I began talking to younger artists, I realized how inspired other younger artists who now are in this exhibition are also by her work. So I can't believe that it is actually here. The Des Moines Art Center staff from every department are absolutely over the moon about this work being here in our galleries. I've had some of the most amazing conversations with colleagues, and we are even more pleased to finally meet Liza in person, to host her in our home full of art. And with that, I would like to welcome Liza Lou to the stage.
Hey, you guys. What the heck? It's Sunday. Did y'all go to church? Or did you come here instead? Okay, how's that? Is that good? So it's Sunday afternoon, and a lot of you might have gone to church. Maybe you didn't. But I love that it's Sunday. I grew up in the church, and so when and I always wanted to be an artist since I was 4 or 5. That was my thing. And when I really made the connection between museums and church, that was when life really made sense for me. That you didn't have to go to church. You could just come here to the Pay building and not so much worship things, but be inspired, hopefully. And I think that that's what artists try to do. What I want to start with is ask how many people here are artists. If you raise your hand. Oh my God. Almost everybody. And then if you're not an artist, but you support the arts, if you raise your hand. Okay. So all of the artists that feel alone sometimes, just like look around the room. That's pretty inspiring. I want to start with a poem that means a lot to me. It's Kay Ryan. We're building a ship as we sail it. The first fear being drowning, the ship's first shape was a raft, which was hard to unflatten after that didn't happen. It's awkward to have to do one's planning in extremis in the early years, so hard to hide later, sleekening the hull, making things more gracious. And that's a lot how I feel about giving talks when kitchen comes up, because it's a work I made 27 years ago. And so it's odd in a way to speak for the 20-year-old. Because obviously, or hopefully, one changes and grows as an artist and shifts. And hopefully you can feel that you don't always have to keep repeating yourself. But people do often ask about the earlier work, the work I'm making now, and how it relates to the kitchen. So in this slide, you're seeing my most recent show that I have had. It's a show of painting, and it's also a body of work that I'm most proud of all the work I've ever made, because it's work about disappearance. It's work about emptiness and void, whereas the kitchen was obviously about fullness and overflow and a kind of almost fear of empty space and a filling. I love this quote by, this microphone kind of echoes a bit, doesn't it? Am I sort of echoey? Is that okay?
Would you rather use a handheld?
I think this is okay. I think we're good. So there's a quote by, well, interestingly to me anyway, the kitchen first went to the New Museum in New York. It was first exhibited in 1996, and the curator, Marcia Tucker, was the first female curator at the Whitney. And she, the sort of the story goes, but it's a little bit of folklore and a little bit not, that she was fired from the Whitney for curating a show of Richard Tuttle's work. And as most of you know, Richard Tuttle's work is very minimal and extraordinarily beautiful and subtle. And so you really have to spend time looking. But Hilton Kramer in the New York Times in the, I guess it was in the 1960s or early 70s, used the Mies van der Rohe quote, the dictum, less is more. And he says about Richard Tuttle, less is unmistakably less. It is indeed remorselessly and irredeemably less. It establishes new standards of lessness and fairly basks in the void of lessness. One is tempted to say that so far as art is concerned, less has never been as less as this. So it's a scorching review, but it's also, I think, such a beautiful review. I mean, in a way, you almost wonder if Richard Tuttle must have said yes, you know, because it's I think, such a great compliment to make something unmistakably less. And so how extraordinary that many, many, many years later, the same curator would see my work, which is unmistakably more. You could rewrite the whole thing. It is indeed remorselessly and irredeemably more. It establishes new standards of moreness and fairly basks in the moreness of moreness. One is tempted to say that so far as art is concerned, more has never been more as this. So there was at the time, I think, when the kitchen first kind of opened into the world and became this object for scrutiny and unabashed kind of moreness, was a kind of what do you say? I want to say a bit of a disappointment for me as a young artist, because I realized that what I had basically done was do something that was going to make me misunderstood forever. Because when I look at this work, and when I was making this work, I was not so much interested in, I think it was asking a lot of questions. It was a lot of, I had a lot of curiosity about why some material is taken seriously and some isn't. Why some people are taken seriously and some aren't, where we listen and where we don't, where you might look at something and how much do you have to do to get people to see something. So it's a piece that took me 5 years to make, and in the making of it, I was surprised by how much I had to do and at what point there would be a tipping point where finally the thing that I thought was like the wow in it could be actually experienced. But I also saw a lot of lessness in it. I saw a certain kind of, like there's a point of maximalism where something almost ceases to exist. And that was something that I was really interested in exploring. So here I am, 27 years later, speaking for the 27-year-old. And I have to say it's really, really kind of difficult because obviously one wants to move on. Some of the slides I'm going to show you are a little bit out of order or out of sequence in terms of timing, but mostly within at least a decade. So this is a work called Trailer, and it's a 40-foot long mobile home, which I bought out in the Mojave Desert, and then gutted the interior and made this environment. And very few people have actually seen it in person. A little bit like the kitchen. One of the things about an artwork and what's so exciting about being here in Des Moines is having this moment where something gets taken out of the crypt after it's been in storage for many months, sometimes many years. This is one of those works which few people have actually seen, but it was recently acquired by the Brooklyn Museum, and so coming soon to a museum near you, hopefully. But it's a work that you can enter. And I was kind of interested in seeing what would happen if you could walk inside a black and white movie, a film noir, and I wanted to know if objects could describe a certain kind of sorrow. So in a way, I was responding to the kitchen here. I was responding to the giddiness of the color and the overwhelm of kind of like all the primary colors all smashed together. What happens when you reduce the color and bring a monochrome to the story of the work? There's also a soundtrack that's going on in the background where people arguing, a kind of muffled sound. And it's kind of describing a crime scene. It's a bit of a play on art making itself as a scene of a sort of crime, or when you make something in the world that it's sort of indelibly made unless you as an artist decide it isn't. As an artist, you can obviously destroy your own work, but once it's out in the world, like for example, one of the things I was thinking about this morning, before coming here, I was thinking about how the kitchen belongs to you just as much as it belongs to me now. I'm not allowed to touch it. I can't go and dance in it like I used to. And other people's opinion is really just pretty much as valid as mine is. And so there's a kind of loss in a way when your work goes into the world and it belongs to other people. It's a loss, and it's also a privilege, I think, to be able to share something that you made and have it, be misunderstood as a privilege too. It's maybe baked into the work. And I've tried to make art over the years that uses misunderstanding as part of what I'm doing, that invites misunderstanding in the same way that the kitchen does. I mean, in other words, the kitchen and this work is working with an art material which, in terms of the art canon, hasn't been taken seriously. It tends to be, I think it's changing and has changed quite a lot, but in the earlier years doing this work, for sure I was sort of working against the tide of what was considered appropriate. I'm also thinking about in the trailer, in this work, sort of men's aesthetic. So this is men's today. Men today, flesh farm of horror. I think there's a certain amount of, and I like also the top of the headline is Lust Roundup. I like these artworks, the earlier things that have a lot of secrets in them. The more that you spend time, you'll find some of the hidden messages that are there, and trying to make something that rewards looking. Now we're jumping ahead by another decade, actually. And this is called Security Fence. And it's a work that is the same scale as the kitchen, and it another enclosure. In some ways, I've tried to stop doing this now, where I'm always responding to the kitchen. And I don't even know if it's responding anymore, or if the kitchen is just inside of my DNA in some interesting way. It was such a formative piece for me because I was really very young when I started it, and because it took so long. It's an interesting dilemma, I think, as an artist, to have one work that you're sort of defined by. It's a fascinating dilemma to have. I sometimes have works, earlier works of mine, that I'll redo. I'll hold them back, I won't show them, and then I'll keep them and open the crates in my own space and respond to it now based on what I know now as an artist, or what I'm thinking about now as an artist. And sometimes when I'll look at early work, I'll think, dang, what if I still had that? Like, what would I do now with the kitchen? What would I, would I go in there and noodle with it a little, shift it up, take some things away? Would anyone notice? And that's an interesting question. I remember thinking in the kitchen, would anyone notice if this blue was not blue, if it was red instead? Like at what point I started to distrust my creativity, that unbridled creativity maybe isn't the thing. In other words, when you look at a painting, especially here in the museum, for example, do you go over to the bacon and say, that blue stroke there, it should have been a horizontal? Do you do that when you read things? I do. I sometimes rewrite a sentence when I'm reading it. And so as an artist, to keep reworking your own work is really a fascinating question, and sort of questioning, like, why do I make the thing I make? I don't think it's my role or my job to theorize too much about my own work. I think it's really kind of not the thing to do for myself personally. I'm more interested in, for example, I was asked to come up with a title for this lecture, and that's really hard for me to do ahead of time. Like, what are you going to talk about? And I thought about the marathon that it is to make art, and the storyline that you're holding. There's another poem I want to share with you. It's a William Stafford. It's called The Way It Is. He says, there's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do stops time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. And I think in a way, as artists, what we're really doing the whole time is holding the thread. We're holding the thing that we love so much. It's so incredibly precious to us. And trying to hold it through a lifetime. Hold it through the mud that you're walking through. Hold it through, as Stafford says, tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. Holding it up the whole time. And it gets heavy, but you keep going. And so there's this kind of storyline that's the thread that's underneath the thing you're making. That's all the time holding the whole thing together. And as somebody who works with a material that requires threading it together, I particularly love this idea. So this is actually the piece that I made straight after I made the kitchen. It was the first work that I made, and after that work, because I wondered, what do you see when you look through the windows of the kitchen? What goes on beyond it? Does it continue? And the answer was, that you would have this lawn and this verdant patch of green grass that we only really have in the Midwest. There's a particular kind of thick, juicy grass that's from the Midwest. And my early part of my childhood was spent in Minnesota, where you just, your toes are kind of like, you're submerged in this incredible, vast green grass. So the idea of a picnic, of this kind of abundance. So going from a kind of labor, thinking about dishes being washed forever and a clean floor that's ever constantly getting dusty and making it permanently sparkle, I wanted to really celebrate labor itself as leisure. So the thread is here. The thread is really, from the kitchen to the backyard, is really, no one has to say, well, what's the relationship? It's pretty clear. And there are flowers, and there are bees. But then this is now, again, this is jumping I think maybe another, maybe this is 15 years from the kitchen. This is called Book of Days. And the thread here is in the making of those sheets. So it's made up of 365 woven sheets, which are all stacked one on top of another. I really liked the obvious reference to Felix Gonzalez Torres, who makes these stacks where the public is invited just to take a sheet. You can't take one of these sheets, I'm sorry, because they're precious in the way that they're made and labor intensive. But I love that too, that something so kind of precious you can't actually see. It's embedded, it's buried, it's going to be completely invisible in some way. And I think that there's something to that, that you only ever see the outside edge of anything, or any of us, that we are all containing this kind of invisibility. That I think there's a longing that some people have to be seen, or at least to be understood. Even the most shy among us want to be seen in some way, maybe not exposed, that's different, but seen, appreciated, valued, and yet we're not really by a culture, especially as artists. There's not a culture that really celebrates, really nurtures art, really values art so much. If the world valued art, we wouldn't have so much ugliness. So we just have to look around. And again, how do we hold that thread, like keeping that afloat against all odds, against all odds, carrying it through the mud. And I love, again, coming back to Stafford, you don't ever let go of the thread. So now, jumping ahead again, this is a body of work called The Clouds. This was a show I did at Lima Maupin in New York in 2018. And I think this ongoing interest that I have in the grid is present here. And also I really, cloths are, look, I only have one image of it, so I'm going to show you from here. They're all woven by hand, one bead at a time, with needle and thread. In my studio, working with women for many years in South Africa. And there was this real interest that I have in again, sort of what we see and what we don't see. Sometimes, in this work, in the kitchen, which is just as much going on as this piece, you might see the labor more easily because of all the color. But when you take color away, it's easy to just not see it. And I think that's true of the clothes we wear, the floors we're walking on. It's easy not to see the labor that we're sitting inside of, or appreciate, or value. And you could become like a Jain, where you don't step on anything, or you just can't take a step without worshiping. I was in India once where I saw these men who were doing a pilgrimage, and in order to take a step, you had to get down on your knees, lay prostrate, and then stand up again. And that's how you took a step. And they would do it for miles. And I think, in a way, if we really were awake and really seeing the beauty around us, we would all walk that way. We would greet each other that way. We would be so overcome by each other, by, my God, you're here, you made it. It's like astonishing. You woke up this morning, you put on your clothes, oh my God, and come down. So as an artist, I feel like I'm trying to say, look, trying to use the material that keeps stalking me, frankly, beads to say, look, like this little guy, this little tiny infinitesimal material, which is like a grain of sand, is so stupid and so ridiculous and so amazing, and it's so simple. Like, can you believe how stupid and simple this is? And yet how astonishing it is? Like, can you believe, like, people could just stitch away at something and it could blow your mind? So that's what I feel like what I'm always trying to get to, like sort of asking myself, can I attune myself to greater and greater and greater sensitivity to the world around me, to my own art material, to my own process, and then still be able to walk like a normal person and not be devastated, because that's the other thing too, is when you want to practice this level of attunement or sensitivity, you also have to toughen up, right? So there's like a combination. And now it's going to go off again. I don't know. Okay. So this is called The Clouds, and it's woven sheets which I painted clouds upon. So you'll see at the top I became interested in my own mark. Like there's something about using beads where your hand starts to, your actual gesture kind of disappears through the materiality. And so I was kind of losing sight of myself as or not myself, but losing sight of my own hand was subsumed in a very labor-intensive practice where I couldn't draw out my own gesture, if that makes sense. So I began to paint onto the material and also smash it away with a hammer, which we'll get to in another image. This is going back in time. I like doing a slide, showing you slides that aren't in a linear order, because I don't think any of us really think in a linear way, like you'll be having coffee with a friend and you'll talk about what you did last night, and then the next thing you know, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember when I was a kid, I did that. We don't, but it's not a neat little row, and I think it's asking a lot to sort of try to live your life like it's an outline. It's not an outline. And I feel really free, or I've given myself permission as an artist to dip into different decades in my work now, which is really fun and freeing, not to have to sort of say, well, you made a kitchen, by gum, you're not allowed to do that. And also I really like to disappoint people a little bit, or push a little, just give a little nudge to see it a little differently, because I think it's so much more fun that way. So I guess what I'm saying is, it took a long time for my work, the kitchen, to be, people said I was crazy for a long time. So I'm always interested in the work I make that people aren't interested in. That always seems like the direction I should go toward. So this is called Gather 1 Million, and it's 1 million blades of grass, which were threaded one at a time with pieces of wire, and 9 beads per thread. And someone's going to sit there and do the math for me, but I'm kind of trying to remember. And it's 202 rows, or stacks, these little stacks that we made, that measured out to 1 million of those, which was really fun because, fun. The backyard was made up of 250,000 of those blades. So it's this gesture, or this technique kind of threading with wire, something that I've been interested in for a long time, as a kind of mark making, as a kind of like a way that you would make a brush stroke. And each bundle is I measured each one and weighed them, and then particularly put a certain amount of white into the gold so that the piece would be gradating. And each bundle is labeled. I didn't bring a slide to show you that, but it's kind of nifty. Because there's this, it's so controlling. It's work that I made for, I guess right now, in this kind of linear way of work I'm showing you, this would be about 15 years of making work that's very, like I would have a brain wave and say, this is what I'm going to make. And then there would be little shifts in it. Certainly in the kitchen, there were a lot of those moments where I would change things. But essentially, you have the thing you're making, and it's not going to divert. So this is a piece from, I think, 2007. It's a body of work that I was making, thinking about the prayer that I was talking about, where you have this level of astonishment. I was looking at prayer rugs in the Middle East, and I was wanting to respond to a certain kind of beauty and labor. Again, looking at carpets, thinking about things we step on. This is made one at a time with the tweezers. The beads are standing up onto the pattern that I painted on a huge aluminum. So actually, this is about the size of the work that you would see in real life. So it's about 10 feet high. And what happened was, I was living and working in KwaZulu-Natal, where I had a studio for 15 years. And we were in the studio working, and there was a kind of a riot that went on outside, and all of the studio team started weeping, and it was a kind of a complicated situation that was going on in the outer world, and I kind of realized that what we were doing in the studio was like creating this minute attention to beauty and order, while all around us outside was total chaos. And the unknown. The team were coming to me like, like I was like, what were we going to do? And they were scared. And everyone got out of the studio okay that day. It was basically what had happened was there was a situation with refugees, and there had been there was a lot of tension between refugees in the townships where they were being kind of terrorized, and they were retaliating. And so the team basically thought these guys were coming to kill them. And anyway, it was one of these situations where when you have a bad day out there, it's not like a normal bad day. It's like a bad day they don't talk about in art school. Like, they don't kind of train you, like, what do you do when there's like major public upheaval kind of stuff. And I remember just thinking, having this shift as an artist, like realizing that, God, I am the whole time trying to make work in a certain way, and I'm not allowing in what's going on around me. And so that's when the pattern broke down and became abstract. The next day, I went in the studio and picked off every part of the thing we'd been working on for months with a chisel and abstracted it. And that's when abstraction entered my work and I just showed the experience that I was going through, because I was going through unbelievable amount of upheaval in my life. And then holding the line all the time about like, but we're making this structure. And I wasn't allowing for the beauty of disorder to influence and inform the work. And so this is where my work became abstract. And I began to see that it was the abstraction itself was far more interesting than the pattern. So this is looking at the material itself. So these are glass beads that are about the size of a shoelace tip, and they're all balanced one at a time, one at a time. And so it's this very slow process. But what's really interesting to me about this kind of way of working with the material is that it's only looking at the very tip of the bead, not the length of it, but the tip. So it becomes this like sort of burning tip of the moment. And it led to, look, when I knew I wanted to try this as like, what would happen if, forget sewing them flat, forget like, what if we just put them on their tips? Like, that will be the slowest way to do this, which seemed really exciting to me. And really hard, like, oh, that's gonna be hard, that's gonna suck, yes. But it also led to this fascinating search around the world to find the bead with the perfect tip. Like, who knew? That, like, I'd been working with beads at that point for, I don't know, 20 years or something, and it's about the tip. Didn't you know that? Who makes the best tip? This is now really skipping ahead here, another few years, but by now I was really listening to what was going on around me in my studio, really listening in the sense that I was saying, the struggle that I'm hearing, that I'm seeing in the personal lives of the people around me and in my own life is now integrated into everything. And so I'm going to make work utilizing not only a material, but a form that really references that. And so it led to making work that's entirely woven, one at a time with needle and thread. This particular work is just as a close-up of what I would call a painting, and it's called Soil Solid. But what you're seeing when you see those streaks across, the white streaks, that is probably more likely what the actual bead would look like, brand new, just coming out of the packet. And the darker areas are dark because of the oil of the hand holding the work over months or weeks or whatever to make that piece. And so it's an oil painting. And it's not oil on the surface. It's oil that's deeply embedded because it's the thread itself. You know, for those of you that sew, you know how long that thread is happening in your hand. It's happening for a long time. You know, you're getting, first it's the moisture that you use when you go to thread your needle. It's the holding, it's the unwinding of that thread. So it's containing the body so that the body and the hand are embedded in the work itself. So this is where I started to see that I didn't need to make a set piece in the way that starting out as an artist, I really needed to show you the labor. But now it's like the labor is embedded, it is the subject, and it's the object. And it can be totally unseen. And it's possible to walk by it and think, oh, there's a minimalist painting, and not step up and see that it's made of beads. And so it rewards people who go to museums or galleries and have the patience to walk over and really spend time and look. And then it rewards that idea of saying, well, but what is it and why and how, what? And also I really love it when it's a so what, because so what, if it can lead to asking questions, is really cool too. That actually happens to be one of my favorite of that body of work, because it's so full of the earth. This is going back to the clouds that I showed you in that previous couple of slides ago, where you saw a lot of white cloths that were, again, sort of, it'd be very easy to look at them and not see what it's made up of. And so I became really curious about the thread inside the weaving. What's underneath there? I know it's beautiful because there's no way to get around it. You can't you can't cheat it through. It's the integrity of that work is that you literally take one bead, you tie it to a string, and take another and pass it through, and it keeps building on itself, and it's creating this network. And so I became really curious about that network. What's the network? So I got a hammer out and smashed the beads off, and then it creates this patterning, and it was kind of exciting to me because there were all kinds of surprises and things that were interesting. For example, the blue was woven with blue thread, and it's so dark and rich underneath what appears on the surface to be pale. And then I became really interested in the painting itself, painting things, and then what happens when I smash away the material and you see the painting underneath onto the thread. I guess in a sort of interesting way, I'm sort of turning these things over and over and over again. And then I became interested in seeing paint itself as a physical object. So these very heavy impasto lines over the glass and then smashing around the painted lines. It got to where, and I still do this when I'll see paintings, I'll think, what would happen if you smashed a little bit of that out? I mean, it's kind of terrible, but that's what's so great about glass, working with this material, is that, because I was sort of asking myself, what does this material do that paint can't do? And also, obviously, what can paint do that the material can't do, which is plenty. For example, blend, add water, add turpentine, like it becomes this viscosity that's really exciting and changing. You can paint over it. Glass is really tough because you just kind of stuck with it. It's this immutable kind of form, or is it? Because it turns out that I think the thread is just as interesting as the glass, and maybe even kind of more so. So these were kind of these exciting moments, and again, still kind of working within a grid setting to explore what can happen if. And this again, this is from my show at Lima Maupin, and you see on the right a couple of drawings, and we'll kind of get to that in a second. But this was asking questions now about building form, going free form from weaving. So weaving that is quite strict and structured, and it's very much on a grid. This is my favorite way to weave, which is just this kind of free form, crepuscular quality where the material becomes kind of turns into almost like an animal or something. It sort of grows as the more and more you build it, made up of many different sizes of glass beads. And this is a drawing which I worked on for about 11 years, and it is very, very related to this, in a sense. I began to wonder what about drawing the material itself. So I'm going to go back and forth and back and forth. I'll do it one more time. No, I won't. So you can see here where this was sort of a thing that you sort of, I think, start to ask yourself after a certain point in time, like, what is the central interest here? Because people, we're going to have question and answers, and maybe we should get a few things out of the way before we do that. Because people always ask me, there's some essential questions, like, what kind of glue do you use? And why beads? And where do you buy your beads? So I used to do these performances where I would actually literally, it would get heavy and intense, and I would still get that same question. Where do you get the beads? So so I asked myself, what is this actually? I mean, I think it's actually, these are quite legitimate questions, honestly. Like, let's just get down to brass tacks. What the heck? What is it about beads? And I think it's really an astonishing truth that every single thing that you could choose, anything, and it could be totally fascinating. Like, just pick anything. Like, there's a lot of people who haven't figured out what their passion is yet. It's just like, well, just pick something. And it will be totally fascinating if you go down into it. Just anything, truly. And I think that that's true, so that the material becomes a kind of metaphor. It becomes a kind of universal truth. Like, it truly is just simply that a small circular shape ends up becoming as small as a grain of sand, like the Blake poem, like a grain of sand, and as large as the entire universe. That this shape is actually, it turns out, true, less is unmistakably less, but it actually ends up becoming the entire universe, and we're all made up of it. So, why beads? Well, they're not beads, and they never have been beads. God damn it, why can't people see? You get kind of frustrated. Aren't you looking? Can't you not see that that's not a bead anymore? The minute that an artist steps up to the stage and spends 5 years on one thing, it's not about the fucking beads. Right? It's not, it can't be. It just simply can't be. Unless that person's crazy, which, okay, but like, it's about making, it's about caring, it's about love, it's about holding the line. It's about truth-telling. It's about courage. God damn it. So I think there's this quality where none of us are seeing anything anymore because we're so inured by suffering and sorrow and tragedy and shit that we can't see beauty anymore and can't even see ourselves anymore. So I'm always turning it around inside of my own self and saying, okay, Liza, what is it? What is this fundamental interest? What is it? Why do you still care? Why? So here we are now back, lightening up just a touch, to a body of work called The Waves. And this is where it's really asks the person looking to say, well, what is this? This is all just a bunch of white cloths. But actually, each one of these is a diary. Each single sheet that you're seeing is a diary of a woman's life who wove that sheet. So when my studio team saw this entire piece installed in Cape Town at the Zeitz Museum, they could literally recognize which ones they made. And everybody was crying. Because it was like being seen. It was like this act of recognition that this thing that you're making while the cat jumps over your lap, and that's why this one bead went off, or there was a little yellow streak and one woman knew that was there because the towel that was on her lap while she was working stained the work. Like you could see your own self inside of it. So it was possible to actually run a marathon with the needle and the thread. And there it is, like, to me, that's like a great abstract painting. But it's made without the will to make, I think I'll put a little brown there. It's the oil of the hand naturally doing that. So it becomes true that our lives, without even trying, are marking paths of beauty. So this actually is probably one of my favorite things that I've ever been part of making, because of how extraordinary each one of these individual cloths are. And when I see this, I see Nontlantla, I see Qebsile, I see Nakotula Ngidi, I see Buchle, I see the team who are here and alive in each one of those stitches. And wait, there's more. This is a little video that will show you my most recent work. So that show was called I See You, and the irony, of course, is that you couldn't really see it at all, and it doesn't photograph. It really simply doesn't photograph. Like even that video is like you have to see it in person and spend time looking, and hopefully it rewards a certain kind of looking. And also underscores invisibility and loss, and the power of letting go, the power of letting go of a material, of letting go of expectations that other people might have of you, and the power of holding the line. So, open it to questions.
All right. Oh, hands are shooting up. I love it. I love it. Okay, we will pass microphones. I'll be on this side. Laura will be on that side. And please wait for the microphone to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Do you know about the 25 million stitches project? Okay, it was 2 or 3 years ago. It was during the time of the pandemic had started, but an artist in California decided she was so upset about the numbers of refugees around the world. At that point, she was thinking 25 million would stand. So she was inviting people from all over the world to contribute stitched panels. And you could either have a 15 by 15 or 30 by 15. And she would send you the piece of muslin, and just ask that you stitch on it by hand. And with each stitch, think about that stitch being a human that has been displaced from their home. Then she assembled them all, but there was finally an exhibit in the Bay Area somewhere in California, but apparently it's being sent around the world. She had people from all over the world contributing stitches. You should look it up, 25 Million Stitches Project. Also, I want to say you must really be influenced by Agnes Martin. I hope so.
I love Agnes Martin very much. Yes, 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 I am. I'm inspired by her rigor. I also really love artists that write. I think someone should do a show on artists who write, on women artists particularly, because I think there's something really fascinating about having a kind of manifesto. And of course, what's so interesting about Agnes is she said, that artists shouldn't have children, they shouldn't have pets, they shouldn't own homes, that you just live your life to the rigor of the work. And I think she made a lot of sense, honestly. And but I was especially inspired by those words when I was living in the fraught moments of my studio life that I was describing earlier. Like, is it possible to work with minimalism, but have it be embedded with humanity, to be knee-deep in humanity and the mess of life, the mess of parenting, the mess of it all, and bring that into minimalism? Could that be? So in a way, I think an artist like Agnes Martin, who's deeply inspiring, also, I think something I try to do in my own work is, where's the pocket of my work that allows room for young artists to come through? Like, in other words, I don't have to be right, and for everyone, everyone else doesn't have to be wrong for me to be right. So I don't want to make a manifesto about my work, but I want my work to be an embrace and an offering and an opening so that a young artist can walk through and say, yeah, well, Liza Lou said this, and I'm going to do, how can I approach this? So you want it to be big enough for other people. And I think that's for sure, Agnes Martin offers that. So you can love someone. I mean, I loved her even when I was making The Kitchen. And people would have said, we could talk, be like, they're so shocked if I would have mentioned her in a talk, right? But she was there. So who?
Here. Thank you for both a wonderful talk and also for being a wonderful seed for the excellent exhibit here. Your pieces seems to be very important, both the space they are in the gallery and the museum, and also the lighting. Do you get involved with consulting with the museum about the space they're put into, and also with the museum lighting people about the lighting, the temperature of the lighting, the type of lighting that is involved when your pieces are installed?
Well, I used to, when it was mine. But it's interesting because when The Kitchen was first shown, for the first several years, everyone would overlight it. And no matter how many times I would say, just lower the lights and let the work have its own little quiet hum, it was like, oh yeah, yeah, and they would blast the lights and it would just be like, it would do this thing that was so blinding. So it's so thrilling now to have that beautiful, low kind of ambient light. And it turns out it's a protective measure as well for the material. But over time, lighting isn't good for it to just have that constant Klieg light. It already had this blast of materiality. It didn't need the, you didn't.
I'm thinking more of some of the more subtle pieces that you showed.
Yeah, if I can have, I definitely have control when some things like a show in a museum or in a gallery, I get to weigh in. But in the case of The Kitchen now, it belongs to the Whitney. The Whitney bring their people here to install. At this point, I feel like the work is in really good hands. So thankfully, I don't have to tell them anymore. But, I definitely, when the kitchen was asked for that lighting, which is now gratefully done. But once it goes into the world, I don't always have control, is the answer to that question.
Okay, I loved what you said about like the kitchen kind of being like this. I'm over here.
Oh, thank you. I'm
Kind of like a disappointment almost, like how it was like one of your big pieces that kind of like brought you into the art world, but also like you kind of feel disappointed by it. But my question is actually, I'm just like very curious about like your living spaces. Like we've seen like the maximalist in you, and we've seen sort of like a more minimal approach. Like I'm just curious, like what do you like to live amongst? Like what is your style and aesthetic in that way?
I love that question. What would you guess?
I'm just trying to picture color in your home, and I can't really, but I think I have no idea.
I'm a total minimalist.
Yeah.
Total, like, clear surfaces, concrete walls, my favorite thing. My favorite way to see my work is on a concrete wall, because it's in reaction. It's a material that's in reaction to something that's like, dry, kind of, you would say, or, yeah, I'm a total minimalist. It is funny, and even making the kitchen, over the years when I would make that, the early days of the kitchen, I was really, really struggling. And so I had different apartments in different places, and then finally a studio, but the studio got destroyed during an earthquake, and I had to evacuate, and it was all kinds of like carrying that through the mud, like this huge thing. But I've always just been a minimalist. Yeah, I love that question. That's so great. Because people, when they first meet me, they would sometimes, especially with the kitchen, imagine I would have wild curly hair and house slippers. They would get so disappointed.
All right, Laura will pass the mic over on the other side.
Hi, thank you for your talk. And this question, I've been going over and over how to phrase it, because I see like two things that you're talking about. And one is the individual holding things up on their own through all the mire and muck. And the other is a more collaborative process, and knowing that people become invisible, people aren't seen, their voices aren't heard. And in your work, the one that had all the individual panels, you even mentioned that you could see who did those panels. But what about the audience? And here I'm not trying to sound obnoxious. I'm really curious because you orchestrated this, and it's your individual holding things up. But then there's all these other people who, to the audience, do become invisible, who were part of that process. And is there any thought about eventually telling their stories somewhere on the wall text, or giving them, putting their names along with yours as producers of this? So in other words, is the individual really walking along alone, holding things up, or are there many others walking and helping? So that's what I was wondering.
That's beautiful, actually. Well, it's an interesting question. I have so many things to say about that. Before I ever give a talk, when I'm asked to give a talk, I evoke a particular woman in my studio. I think of her, and I hold her. And I think a lot about who my work is for. And is it for myself? Is it, at a certain point, I began to say, is the making of my work possible? Is it possible through the making of it to have a resonance to the people who make it? Because I can't control who and how people appreciate art. It's going to be misunderstood. It's possible to just be making another thing. It's going to a gallery, whatever. It's going to sell maybe or not, or like where's the meaning? So if I start to think consciously about how it's made, can that make a difference to a group of women, say? And now I'm sitting in a studio with Nontlantla. Think of her. She's the person I evoke and think of. And, what is, in listening to Nontlanట్లా's stories, I'm not here to tell her stories. She passed away, actually. Deep listening and asking the team that work with me, what do they want? Are they the person that wants to stand up like I have to stand up and stand here and risk and take the brunt of criticism, of praise? Not necessarily, maybe want to have a private life. When works that I make that were made in collaboration, I always ask that people's names be acknowledged, and in catalogs and in writing, I always put their names in. And I have written about it as well, written about my practices in the studio. So I hold that question really dear to my heart, because it's a question about who is celebrated, who isn't seen. And it's a very complicated thing, but it's absolutely true that I'm not the only one standing there holding that, especially when I'm working in collaboration, either here in the US or anywhere that I'm working, or even when I said at the very beginning of this talk, how many of you are artists and how many of you support art? And it's so beautiful to know that it's actually, we're surrounded by a certain amount of support, so none of us are standing alone. Like we're all like the ground that we walk on. So it's a deep question, and I don't have the answer to it. I lived through those questions though, and the years that I spent working in collaboration in my studio in South Africa was a 15-year work, and in those 15 years, it was asking really difficult questions about power, about race, about privilege, and important questions, I think. And questions that I don't have an answer to, but at least I was sort of willing, I feel like, to get in there and ask those questions. So yeah, I hope that answered a little bit.
I was hoping you'd have a really definitive answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I haven't solved that one because it's also a question of authorship, right? So I have to say this, in terms of when I work with other people, I feel like it's really, really important that there is a person that's like, knows what, if you're on an airplane, I really want there to be a captain. I really want there to be a pilot. I don't want a collaborative effort there. So I think as an art, I really, really think that you better know what it is you're making. So I know the team that worked with me were really appreciative of that, because they could just do the work, and then it was on me to make sure that it went in the world, on me to make sure it was an artwork. And I didn't want to make a polemic. I didn't want to make artwork that was just like, I didn't want to borrow on other people's stuff and borrow on other people's stories. So it was really important to me, actually, to say, no, this is actually the work that I'm making, but I do make it with these beautiful people, and they do have enormous talent, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I'm the pilot of the ship here. I'm saying, like, what would happen if this? So I'm like very much the choreographer of this dance. And I think that's something that's really important, at least for me, because that's the decision that I made in working with other people, that I'm going to be the choreographer. I'm not going to ask, what do you think, and then like change it and have it be this medley of other voices. That wasn't my particular vision. But this project that was described earlier is very much that vision. It's very much saying, bring all of these different narratives, and it's a totally different story. But again, there's many ways of doing this. That was just mine.
Laura, I see it. There's a gentleman or woman, yep, with a question in the front. There we go.
And this is maybe actually just a little bit of a response to Lenore's question. I just wanted to let you know, for me, when you started saying all of those women's names and that they were able to see themselves in those panels, I also, as somebody who makes things and makes things in long form, very much understood that and started to understand that relationship. I was hoping somewhere in your talk you would talk about that labor and the shared labor that is in your work. I also work with shared labor, some of whom is actually in this room with me today, which is really nice. But like, I know that feeling of being able to see myself in the objects that I make and being able to share that with other people is really beautiful. So thank you for bringing that to the work right at that moment here today. Thank you.
I think it's a subtlety that is attuning yourself to a certain type of subtlety without there being text or a polemic. I really want to make an artwork that stands on its own without having to know a storyline behind it. I want you to be able to see the kitchen without knowing anything about me, anything about it. You could just come to this work and have it tell you things. So I always demand that of everything that I make, that it simply tells its own story. It might become more interesting, might be like a little bit more helpful if you know more, but I think art should stand on its own without, it doesn't require, I think wall text is great, and it's important to have scholars that go and dig deep and give us more. But especially when you're working with subtlety, it's about asking an audience to be willing to look at subtlety. It takes more time. Yeah, and it's also living with questions that aren't going to be answered, and that's tough.
I was just curious if you were influenced at all by Judy Chicago's work.
I was inspired by her when I was a student, and I read Through the Flower. And that was very, very inspiring to me. It was a very early kind of formative moment to, it's great in this show, Martha Rosler's Semiotics of the Kitchen are here, and that's really exciting to me to have the kitchen in the same vicinity as that work. And so I think that there's a point at which the kitchen is responding to kind of first wave feminism in general. And again, that thing that artists do where they make this body of work, but there's an opening for someone else to kind of come in and maybe even react against a certain thing. And so that it isn't that you take that and keep going, but sometimes you could actually be a little bit in opposition. So the kitchen, in a way, I wanted to make something that was really seductive and really funny. There was a moment in, I guess in the 90s where feminism and work, there was no humor. Like I didn't feel like it was kind of sexy. And I kind of and I had so many friends, I couldn't believe that if you were a woman, you wouldn't be a feminist. Why would you not be a feminist? I don't even understand. But it wasn't kind of sexy. And I kind of thought that it should be funnier. It should be wittier. It should be more lighthearted. I was kind of going, because when I was making early pieces from the kitchen, I was so criticized it wasn't serious enough. I didn't have a tampon or something. And it was so I just wanted to be yeah, but jazz hands,
I noticed a couple of things between the kitchen and the space that you created in that little mobile home that was more of had a male vibe to it. And I noticed that in the kitchen, you don't feel the identity of the person that inhabits that room, because it's all about family, more of a family feeling, whereas the other one, it's a very particular personal identity. Was that a conscious choice that you strove to create between the two of those?
Oh, that's so interesting. So you didn't feel like a character in the kitchen. You don't imagine one type of person.
No, but I see when you talk about being seen, I don't see a personality or a person in the kitchen, but in the other, I do. I see somebody who's a writer who might be consumed with certain topics and have a lifestyle, and that's displayed, very prominently. So I see one as being consumed and the other as being exhumed, I guess.
Wow, that's great.
Buried as opposed to being not buried or, brought out, I guess.
Yeah,
I didn't know if that was a conscious thing that you thought about doing, or?
That's really great, because in the kitchen, I definitely had characters that I was thought of. Like, in fact, early in the kitchen, I used to be the character. It started as a performance art, where I would dress up in a wedding gown, actually, and show up and be like, I'm so overdressed, at these events. And I would have all this stuff that I was making. I was making all this beaded, like, crazy stuff, like a shopping cart, and had all this, I had a truck along, and so I was describing, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of funny feminism. I was describing a certain amount of, like, I don't know, I had a definite character. She was like this kind of I Love Lucy kind of, I don't know, it was pathetic and sad and funny and glamorous, and like this whole thing, I had this hair and curlers, and it was like white hair. It was very funny, actually. I think I might have been the only one laughing, but I thought it was funny. And then I started to realize, I need to make a room, I need to make this thing, and then it turns out that over time I was describing the life of this like thing. And then I became her, though. I became more and more quiet, more and more shy, more and more, because that was all I was doing. And it was like, I became the person that I set out to describe. And so by the end, so I stopped performing or doing anything like that until the kitchen was finished, and then I would have to give talks and stuff, and it was like really hard. But so the character was me. And in the trailer, for sure, you're right. There was, I was thinking about Ted Kaczynski at the time, who was a Unabomber, and I was thinking about like this lonely guy out there in a trailer. What is he getting up to in these rooms, which is very American, that we kind of go in our little rooms and do weird things. What are they doing?
But he's creating his life. That's aside from maintaining a life, with dishes, with. I don't know. I just,
that's interesting.
It's a stark, to me, it's a stark difference. I mean, they're both real, and they're both, just integral to living. But, I mean, a man could have inhabited the kitchen and be a person that had children, and he didn't have a wife or something. And of course, it would be as crazy, and dishes would be all over the place, the same. But in the other room, I don't see a female energy.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a kind of queer aesthetic to the kitchen that, for sure, like I would sometimes think about what man would make it if he was making it, like my best friend. Yeah, there's a kind of a Mardi Gras kind of party going on. Yeah, I mean, it's why when people would meet me...
It's a very joyful, it's actually a very joyful place. The other is not joyful, but it's, I don't know, they're just different. And we could go on and on a bit.
The underside, in a lot of ways. Yeah, I love that.
The other thing I just wanted to comment about was as you progressed into the beadwork in future decades and started unraveling things a little more, and the freedom that must have been a feeling, did you feel like you were freer? Did you feel more of a freer sense? I mean, I know you're still working with very tiny beads, but so I don't know how freeing it could be, but I'm just thinking how organic, things started to express very organically, and I was thinking, how did you feel a freer feeling with that, or is it all just the same? I don't know.
It's just sort of acts of listening, just really kind of like listening more deeply and saying to the material what it wants to be. Yeah, and I think freeing is that's a really great, I'm not sure. I'm never having fun, really. It's really hard, and it's really, the worst thing is when you feel like something you're making isn't working. There's nothing worse than that. So it's, on mostly hard days, and then a day where you go, wow. Because it takes a long time for something I'm making to be far enough along to see that it's going to work. So sometimes I can spend months and months on something and end up destroying it. So it's not really freeing till it's done.
Liza, I see a question here, and then I'll see a question here, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Yes.
Actually, I have 3 questions.
Oh, Pat, maybe just one.
Do you use a thimble? Do you ever feel overwhelmed by the volume of your materials? And what glue do you use?
Oh my God, okay. Where's the exit button? Do I use a thimble? Sometimes, not really. I mean, I have a pretty, not so much. Do I ever feel overwhelmed? Oh my God, yes. Oh, yes, honey. What was the last one? Glue. Not gonna go there. No, girl. Nope. You got 2. We gave you 2. Just white glue, okay? Really? Just white craft glue.
Okay, I'm right here. So, kind of, you mentioned the queer aesthetic, and that was something that I noticed as you were talking about your art, is that, especially as you were talking about, you know, mentioning the identity and, you know, being seen versus not being seen, that's something that it started to resonate with me personally, and so I started to wonder if that was something that you had kind of paid attention to as you were thinking about it, and had any, like, you know, if that kind of culture was something that you had experienced, and I guess if it was something that you had given thought to as you were creating these works, since I just thought there was such a heavy connection between the cultures and the themes. And then once you mentioned the queer aesthetic, I was like, oh, okay, so now I do want to ask that. Especially because, and then when you mentioned the performance, it kept connecting me. I was like, oh, this feels very campy. It feels very like derived from like almost like a drag performance. So I was just wanting to ask if you had like any like thought or like connection to that you were thinking about as you made your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how you can be making something and not know who your friends are. You know, like you could just be making something and you're just weird and you're alone and you think, you know, I'm the only person doing something really weird, and then it turns out like tons of people really find it interesting, and you belong somewhere, that, you know, something that you made you're appreciated in the same way that you personally appreciate that. So it's kind of like that, you know. So I feel like there's this, you know, this great comment about like who's in there. Those are kind of like these really interesting questions to ask, like when you look at an artwork, to imagine what kind of person would you have to be, what kind of questions would you have to ask to have arrived at that painting or that artwork. Like, and that's where, you know, yeah, sexual orientation becomes interesting. Obviously, race becomes interesting. Gender becomes, all that stuff becomes interesting. Like why it matters, actually, why it's an important part, because it becomes part of the art material, right? But also, it could just be that you have a lot of friends. You know what I mean? Like your work has a lot of friends, and so it's exciting to me to. 27 years later, making an artwork that it was totally against the rules. Like, in other words, like you're making something out of a material that's not being taken seriously. And now here we are, where there's like a huge conversation about what would be seen as like an LGBTQ aesthetic, which has to do with a certain materiality and a certain exuberance and a certain, you know, like the fabulousness of gay pride. All of that could also be, you know, like that maybe the kitchen could help be part of that conversation, or maybe it relates to that. Oh, even though me, myself, I wasn't thinking like that. I wasn't on those, if it's like something, or maybe I was, I don't know, you know? Like it's like, I was just flying my freak flag, you know? I was just like, but I'm doing this, and I couldn't believe that people couldn't see it. You know, I mean, I kind of actually going back to this poem, right? Like it's like where Stafford says, you know, there's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change. People want, in other words, life changes around you. So you might be doing something that everyone right now hates because it's not the historical moment. Because everything around you changes, but you don't change. You keep holding the line of the thing you want to do, right? People wonder about what you're pursuing.
oh, what are you doing? That's so stupid. Ugh.
You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. And then the last line, you don't let go of the thread. Like, while you hold it, you can't get lost. Do you get that? Like, how amazing that is? Damn. So I hope that all you all hold it.
Liza, that was incredible. It's Jill speaking here. Everyone, the gallery is open until 4 o'clock today, and there are also some signed catalogs in the museum shop if you would like to pick up one of those catalogs in the shop. And again, Liza, thank you so much. My heart is overwhelmed right now. That was great. Thank you, everybody.